Shalom, shalom, I'm Chris, and let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. We are in the first of 4 lessons on the Sermon on the Mount. This time we'll be covering the first part of Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 19. There is a parallel section in the Gospel of Luke that looks at something similar to Matthew's list of Beatitudes, not quite the same. That's in Luke 6, 21 through 26. We always want to be reminded of Acts 17:11. Now those Bereans received the word with great eagerness, but they didn't just take someone's word for it. They examined the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. Let's remember our blessing that I picked up in one of my commentaries. May the truth of the Sermon on the Mount penetrate our hearts, lifting us from the mediocrity that characterizes our society. May we be doers of your word and not hearers only. Amen. We'll start by looking at a map showing the geography of the area. We think we know pretty much where the Sermon on the Mount was given. Then we'll look at some introductory thoughts specifically to the Beatitudes, look at the Greek and Hebrew words underlying those statements. Then we'll get into salt and light, and then we'll learn that Jesus did not come to abolish the Torah, and more importantly, maybe ask why he felt the need to make that proclamation. So we'll get into that as we move through the study. Sermon on the Mount takes place right around the Sea of Galilee. We believe it's just north of the city of Tagpa. And as Schlegel writes in his Satellite Bible Atlas, he says the Sermon on the Mount parallels the giving of the law to Israel at Sinai. In fact, another commentator says this is nothing less than Jesus giving his Torah on the mountain, and it's a Torah that in no way conflicts with the original version given by Moses. It's really enhancing and clarifying. Schlegel continues, with his new apostolic base, Jesus went up on a mountain and claimed to fulfill the law and the prophets. And we read that in verse 17 of chapter 5. He also claimed ultimate authority for interpreting the law, and we'll see that throughout this chapter 5, more so in the next lesson when we get into the extensions. You have heard it said, but I say to you, those statements. Schlegel continues, he made himself a focus of a new community that would experience temporary difficulties, but would in the end be blessed. And so as we look at the Beatitudes, those are maybe those contradictory statements where you may be suffering now, but at the end in the kingdom, you will have your reward and things will be made right then. So again, we aren't sure of the exact location where Jesus spoke the Sermon on the Mount. We know it was near Capernaum by a reference in Luke chapter 7, and it was somewhere on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. This traditional location here is marked by a Catholic church. The modern church dates only to the 1930s, but it does fit the geographical details given in the New Testament, specifically in Matthew and Luke. Luke makes reference to a level plain area, and if we study this terrain, it's hilly, but there are several points where the land flattens out. So really, either location is fine for either gospel passage. So he could have been up in a level area, up on a plain, or up on a mountain. In fact, both could be true, actually, if you look at the geography. The scripture that we see, when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying. That reminds us that although large crowds assembled around him, this teaching was primarily for his disciples. They're for those that he already called and for those who had already chosen to follow him. So in other words, Jesus wasn't teaching the unsaved how to get to heaven. He was teaching his disciples, his Talmidim, how to have the highest standards of behavior and represent him effectively. Remember, in Luke's chronology, he had just called his 12 apostles, and now he's going to pour into them on what it means to be an apostle. So with this perspective, we have to remember we don't keep the Sermon on the Mount to get saved. It's not a step-by-step plan on how to get access to the kingdom. We keep the Sermon on the Mount to the best of our ability because we already are his. And that's just a key distinction we need to keep in mind. Why bring this up? Well, Martin Luther said he was crushed by the Sermon on the Mount, and he actually referred to it as a counsel of despair because in his view, it was a list of impossible commands no one could follow. Respectfully, though, I have to disagree because Jesus would not demand things that we are incapable of doing. In fact, the Torah of Moses is not impossible. It is our sin and our rebellion that makes it very difficult to keep the command, and that's why we get caught up in our failure. And there is a point where the law is made to show us our sin. It's made to show us we can't do this. But Luther's words, to me, indicate he was trying to keep Jesus' commands in his own strength. But we have to remember Philippians says, the letter to Philippians says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Paul wrote that in Philippians 4:13. And above all, we need to remember there is no condemnation at all for those who are in Christ Jesus. So it's our selfish nature that actually is the problem. It's not the words that Jesus wrote, and it's not the words that Moses gave in the Torah. Our selfish nature may have no interest in loving our enemies, but as Amy Jill Levine says, the Sermon on the Mount assures us that we are wondrous creatures with unlimited potential. So rather than seeing it as a counsel of despair, I think we need to view these words almost like an athlete in training. Jesus' words here could be compared to a coach who's motivating us to dig deeper, to try harder, and just to be better, to excel. And on that note, when an athlete fails, when a major league batter goes to the plate and strikes out, he doesn't lose his status as an athlete. He doesn't stop being an athlete. And in the same way, when we fail, and we'll strike out from time to time, we don't lose our status as disciples. We just get up and promptly, try and watch the tape and figure out what we did wrong, and then we return back to our training and living it out like this. Amy Jill Levine says his calling is to kingdom living. And the surprising thing, the kingdom is not merely something we look forward to in the future. The sermon tells us the kingdom is already available to us. So when we do God's will on earth as it is done in heaven, then we are getting a taste of the future kingdom. Hebrew as well as Greek has two different words for blessed. One is in Hebrew would be bracha, and that would be a blessing, like we're asking God for some favor. We're asking God to bless whatever endeavor we're undertaking. That's not the word here. The word here in Greek would be Makarios, and the equivalent Hebrew word would be Ashrei. And this is in contrast. This is not asking God for something that we're lacking, but more the thought that we're recognizing an existing state of happiness or good fortune. We are blessed. And so that's an important distinction to keep in mind. We're affirming a quality that's already present. So it's not a temporary state of happiness. I kind of don't like the translations that say happy are those who mourn, because that just sounds like a contradiction. But blessed are those who mourn is something that we can be content even though we're mourning. And so a translation might be deeply contented are those who are in the Lord and those who mourn. We are deeply contented because we are his disciples, and because we are his disciples, we will inherit the kingdom. So a good way to think of this term blessed as we read it in the first part of Matthew chapter 5. So let's pick it up in verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we have to ask, what is poor in spirit? Now it's interesting that Luke just says, blessed are the poor. But this does not necessarily mean materially poor. So poor in spirit carries something deeper. Bailey suggests that the poor in spirit would be the humble and the pious who seek God, and that is consistent with Isaiah 66 verse 2. But I will look to this one, at one who is humble and contrite in spirit and who trembles at my word. So that's a one possible explanation of poor in spirit. Lancaster wrote, the poor in spirit might be affluent, but they conduct themselves with the lowly attitude of the poor. So it's a spirit of contriteness and humility. And as we said in our intro, the primary audience were the Talmidim, were the disciples. So they're already saved. So Jesus is not talking about getting access to the kingdom of heaven by being poor. These are folks who already have access. Remember, the term blessed denotes a quality that is already present. If you're a Talmidim, if we're Talmidim, we should be poor in spirit. We should be this contrite and humble. And if so, then we already possess the kingdom. And this is in the same way that an heir is already an heir. They can't not become an heir to their parents' estate. They just haven't completely fulfilled it yet. So it's that same kind of thought. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So here's one where a simplistic translation of happy absolutely misses the point. Mourners are typically sad and not happy, and they have good reason to be sad. If there is mourning, then some form of suffering must lie behind it. And so all these Beatitudes are just reminding us to have the kingdom view. We don't just go with the ups and downs of life and figure that's all there is. We have a deeper purpose and a wider term, a wider view, a longer term view. In that context, most Jews in the first century had a reason to mourn because at that time Israel was subjugated under Rome politically and the corrupt Herodians and the Sadducees religiously. So Jesus' affirmations here would have resonated deeply. They mourn for the temple. They mourn that they're not self-governing. And the promise is that they shall be comforted. Our permanent state of blessing lies in the fact that God comforts us, even when our temporary emotional state may be sad or tearful. This is a picture of the Dominus Flevit Church on the Mount of Olives, and it marks the location where the Lord wept, and it was designed to be in the shape of a teardrop, which I find interesting. So we have to remember why Jesus came. Isaiah 61, he read this in the synagogue at Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim release to the captives and freedom to the prisoners. So we have this, Jesus is coming to the broken people. And we'll get to this term a little bit later. In Hebrew, it's called tikkun olam. And that means repairing or fixing the broken things of this world. Now, in modern Judaism, that's been kind of co-opted for, more left-leaning causes. But the literal words describe what exactly Jesus did. He came to fix the broken things of the world. And as disciples of his, we mourn for the world around us. We mourn for the brokenness that's around us. And when we know we can turn to God and we can experience his comfort through all this as we're sad, and then we can end up being a blessing to others. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Dr. Bolin writes, the hope that Jesus offered those who followed him was not a one-way flight into heaven for all eternity, but an inheritance of the land that God had promised to Abraham and his children. So we'll get to, when we get to Revelation, we get to the new heavens and the new earth, and that could be what Jesus has in view here. On the surface, for that culture, this was an odd claim because of, again, the Roman occupation. The Romans were definitely in possession of the land, and Lancaster speculated that Jesus may have been specifically trying to call out the Zealot movement. So the Zealots were the ones who advocated for armed resistance against Rome and armed overthrow. Basically, they were terrorists. So in a divine reversal, Jesus is saying that's not how we're going to do this. We're going to be meek. And only those who do exactly the opposite of what the Zealots advocate will inherit the earth. So what then is meekness? According to Bailey, he writes, one who accepts the guidance of God and obediently follows God's will, neither too bold nor too timid. Being in meek is harmony with being angry over injustice inflicted upon others. So again, many in the audience would have recognized Jesus borrowing from Psalm 39, 9 through 11. For evildoers will be eliminated, but those who wait for the Lord will inherit the land. Yet a little while, and the wicked person will be no more. And you will look carefully for his place. He will not be there. But the humble will inherit the land and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity. So there's this term in the Bible called divine reversal. And it's basically things are not as they seem. So here we have the humble contrasted with evildoers and the wicked. And so the reversal would say, although the evil appear to be prospering now, it is actually the meek and the humble who are truly prosperous and who will truly inherit. And that is a lot of the gist of the 7 letters in Revelation. We'll look at one of those as we move through. But they may be suffering now, but God sees their suffering and God is with them and promises them to prosper down the road. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Luke narrows the focus to physical hunger and physical fullness, but in Matthew's account, Jesus is using these physical terms to describe spiritual realities, and he does this quite a lot. Kenneth Bailey writes, many in the original audience would personally have known unrelenting hunger as well as life-threatening thirst. Lancaster writes, as the Jewish people groaned under Roman tyranny, they hungered and thirsted for God to vindicate them. And Jesus assures them that one day they would truly be satisfied. This term righteousness, it's worth our study. There's a lot of references in the Proverbs, specifically the righteous versus the wicked. And so it's not so much a behavior, but is a behavior that stems from a relationship with the Father or a status with the Father. So if righteousness is a status that the believer already has, then what does it mean to thirst for it? So again, we need to think of this as two sides of the same coin. So on the head sides, God declares us as righteous, and this is a free gift. But then on the tail side, the gift requires a response. And we see that in Micah 6:8. He has told you, O mortal one, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. So God gives us the status of righteousness, and in return, we are going to behave like one who is righteous. And this is what we need to hunger and thirst after. Because can any one of us say that we always, 100% of the time, act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God? I don't think so. And so it's a reminder we can't do these things to get saved, but we strive to walk with humility and kindness and do justice because we are saved, because we want to represent our Father the best way we possibly can. So again, I keep saying this over and over again because it's a subtle heresy in the Protestant teaching that we are just hopeless sinners and we can never do anything good. So the kind of unspoken conclusion is there's no point in even trying. All of our righteousness is as filthy rags. And while that's true, that is true when we try to bring righteousness in our own strength. But we need to remember Philippians 4:13. We do things through Christ who strengthens us. And Christ here is asking us and demanding us to hunger and thirst for righteousness, to do the things that are in Micah 6:8. So like the star athlete, I love that comparison because we're in training here. The athlete never stops training and never stops trying to improve. And so we should never be content with our level of righteousness. We can always do better. And sort of like if you know an athlete has, they've competed and they've given it his or her all and left it all on the field, as the saying goes, they're satisfied. And so our satisfaction comes from knowing we are centered in God's will for our lives and we are representing him as best as we possibly can. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. In English and in Greek thought that our language comes from, we have these concepts that are more abstract. But in the Hebrew mindset, anything that we might consider an abstract thought must translate into action. So merciful is not just a state. You have to have actions that show you're merciful. And what comes into my mind is the father in the prodigal son story. Luke 15:20 says, when he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him. And did he just leave it, say, I feel compassion on you? No, he ran and embraced him and kissed him. So the father's compassion or mercy was accompanied by the act of running towards his son. And this is something a father in that day would not typically do for a son, especially a son who has brought disgrace on the entire family. So this is really an incredible picture here. Jesus often has compassion for the people around him, and we see that those are always associated with some compassionate action. So it's been said that grace is getting something you don't deserve. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve. So in our context, I think as a starting point, the merciful would start with forgiving each other. The more justified we are in not forgiving someone, I think is the sign the more we need to forgive. And we need to remember that all we have done and all we have been forgiven of. And so the merciful person, the one who has this heart, again, not limited to forgiveness, but at least starting with forgiving one another. The more we do that, the more we experience a taste of God's kingdom here in this life. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And again, in more of a Hebraic thought, the heart is really your entire person, your feelings and emotions, your thoughts, things you pursue. And so a pure heart would be one who loves the Lord and loves his or her neighbor as his or herself. So Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so that kind of purity where nothing is getting in the way, and we symbolize that by baptism. And so here's a picture of someone getting baptized in the Jordan River. The Jewish people would immerse in a mikveh, something that our baptism actually comes from, and that is to symbolize their purity and their cleanliness. Psalm 24, who may ascend unto the hill of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? One who has clean hands and a pure heart, one who has not lifted up his soul to deceit, and has not sworn deceitfully. Psalm 11:7, for the Lord is righteous, he loves righteousness, the upright will see his face. And so this thought of seeing, and the Gospels has a theme of spiritual sight, spiritual blindness versus spiritual vision. And so a person with a pure heart has clear spiritual vision. And later in the Gospels, we'll see that certain religious leaders want to focus on external purity, but Jesus will redirect them to say, no, it's internal purity that is what is important here. And he will actually do this later in chapter 5 when he's talking, giving his exposition on the Ten Commandments. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. So no, not that kind of peacemaker, but the kind of peacemaker that is into actively pursuing peace and making peace. We often think of peace as an absence of conflict, but Jesus again says here, peace needs to have an active component. The righteous pursue loving relationships with friends, family, communities, and nations. We also have to pursue peace with ourselves, because we have to identify and resolve any internal conflicts that are causing us to make bad choices that harm ourselves or others. So anyone who's involved with Celebrate Recovery is in that ministry of making peace with yourself and peace with your past and making peace with people you've hurt as well as people who have hurt you. We talked about this phrase tikkun olam, that is loosely translated as fixing the broken things of the world, or as the logo here says, repairing the world. This is what Jesus came to do. All of these things that were broken, we read in Isaiah 61. He came to do that, and then we as his disciples should follow his lead. And again, this is perhaps another attack on the zealot movement that called for armed resistance. And no doubt there were probably some Roman soldiers in attendance here, and so there may be in a pragmatic way. You know, our movement is a movement of peace. We're not calling for overthrow of the Romans, but certainly he probably had some zealots here in his group. We know of one, at a minimum, Simon, who started joining Jesus because, hey, this is a way for me to advance my goal of getting this group together and overthrowing the Romans, because that's what one version of Messiah is. That's what the Messiah is supposed to do. Psalm 34, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. So not just the absence of conflict, but taking the next step and doing whatever we can to live at peace with one another. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So on the left, we have a bust of Nero, a notorious persecutor of early Christians, and according to tradition, Peter and Paul both died under his authority. And then on the right, we have Domitian, who was the emperor in the late 1st century and persecuted Christians and as well as Jews, and was responsible for ordering John the Apostle dipped in oil as a way of his death, but he was miraculously saved. So our modern world in America is largely absent persecution, and that causes some of us to try and manufacture it. But I've got news for you. Someone saying happy holidays to you instead of Merry Christmas does not count as being persecuted for righteousness' sake, nor does going out of your way to poke the bear so that people treat you poorly. That doesn't count as persecution either. The righteous one maintains a special status with God, which, as we said, requires an in-kind response from us. So while we pursue peace, the world is going to come back at us with persecution. And so if we're despised, or worse, for promoting the things of God, then we can legitimately claim that we are persecuted. So I'm reminded of the 7 letters to the 7 churches, specifically the second letter that is written to the church at Smyrna. And I think this beatitude is really exemplified by what John wrote via the words of Jesus to the congregation at Smyrna. So these guys were persecuted by Domitian. You can see his picture on the screen there. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. The one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, the assemblies. The one who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. So even if we are called to lay down our lives for Jesus, then we know that he is watching over us, and it may not be the outcome we want, but we will inherit the kingdom of heaven after that by virtue of our faithfulness. Verse 11 and 12 are sometimes thought to be a continuation of the previous beatitude, but a lot of others view this as a separate one. In any case, it's interesting. Note, he changes from the third person to the second person. He says, "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And here's a picture of Elijah at Mount Carmel. He was definitely persecuted by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. He also deviates, Jesus does, from his typical pattern of the first 8, which would have been, "Blessed are you when people insult you, for so men persecuted the prophets who were before you." He adds some extra statements in here, and he does the same thing in Luke, interestingly enough. So let's look at this design of Matthew 5, 11, and 12. So we start with an opening line, "Blessed are you when people revile you." And then we have a couple of negative statements, "and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely." And then in the middle of this, we're going to have a reference to Jesus, "on my account." And then we have a couple of positive statements, "Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven." And then a closing line, "In the same way they persecuted the prophets before you." So what's fascinating is Luke 6:23 has almost the identical design. We've got the opening line, "Blessed are you when men hate you," and then Luke's going to have 3 negatives and 3 positives. And when they exclude you and revile you and cast out your name as evil. And then again, in the middle, a reference to Jesus, "on account of the Son of Man." And then the 3 positives, "Rejoice in that day, leap for joy, for your reward is great in heaven." And then a closing line, "for so their fathers did to the prophets." So that's the design, which I think is just fascinating that we see in both Matthew and Luke. So all of 9 Beatitudes in Matthew describe Jesus' character traits, which we are to emulate. And then the 9th culminates with a call to remain loyal to him in the face of persecution. One commentator here suggested we have a pivot because the Beatitudes would be the future tense, and the remainder of the chapter is the present tense. So being salt and light are things we do in the here and now, but we are always to maintain the long view when we are persecuted or when we mourn, or we're always to hunger and thirst for righteousness. We have to remember that our permanent kingdom, our home, is not in the here and now, but is in the age to come. So now let's look at salt and light. "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how could it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by people." So this is along the shore of the Dead Sea. There's just large quantities of salt and other kinds of minerals. And in fact, in the Bible, the Dead Sea is also known as the Salt Sea. So the first thing to note is that Jesus doesn't say you should be salt of the earth, or you might become salt of the earth, or keep trying hard and you will become salt. It actually says you already are salt of the earth. So no matter where you are in your walk with Jesus, you already are salt. And we'll find the same thing is true regarding light. Salt in that day and even today has 2 main purposes. First is preserve, particularly preserving meat, and it does that by inhibiting the growth of bacteria, and it draws out moisture. And we also use it today to enhance flavor. And so in the same way as disciples, we are to be the force for good. We preserve and restore the broken things that keep out the bacteria of the world, if we might want to put it that way. That's, again, getting back to that phrase, tikkun olam. But we often miss the point in the second phrase. If salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? What I think Jesus is saying here, it is chemically impossible for salt not to be salt. Salt without salinity would no longer be called salt. And we see this by if we mix salt with different other chemical compounds, we don't have salt anymore. If you add vinegar to salt, one of the resulting liquids you get is hydrochloric acid, which is highly poisonous. So to me, there's what he might be saying here is what happens to us when the world gets mixed in with us, because our salt is gone and it could be transformed into something poisonous. So I think his point is that it is equally absurd when disciples fail to live according to his teaching. So to put another way, if I call myself a disciple, but I don't obey his commands, I may not be a disciple. I'm not really salt. We might say I'm not truly saved, because the disciple of his is salt, and the disciple of his is light. And because we're those things, we need to be serving our purpose. And so salt, again, is designed to preserve and to add flavor, and light is, again, designed to light the world. And so he's going to get into this on the next passage. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. And perhaps the most prominent hilltop in that day was the Decapolis city of Hippos, which you can see here in this picture. It's unoccupied today, but it's not difficult to imagine how imposing it must have looked, because it sits on a hill, and on a clear day, it's visible from all around the Sea of Galilee. It's said that at night, the Romans would set torches, which would have been visible from all around. So we have this concept of a city on a hill is supposed to bear light. One of Jesus' I am statements comes in John chapter 8, verse 12. I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So Jesus is light. He passes that on to us. So similar to salt, we don't become light. We already are light if we are his. Verse 15 continues, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the stand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So this oil lamp sits on the ledge in a wall so it can light the house. And this is in this great place we'll visit when we go to Israel in a Katsrin. So first century houses, what they would do is they would have these niches of protruding stone that are about chest high, and these would be the lampstands that you set your light on. And so this is where a light belonged. So in the same way that it's just absurd to have salt without salinity, you wouldn't have a lamp under a basket. That would just be kind of ridiculous and not serving its purpose. Your light must shine before people in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So disciples of Yeshua, of Jesus, should be conspicuous to everyone. Our saltiness and our light are good works that we do in the name of Jesus. The Bible never teaches us not to do good deeds. It teaches us not to be prideful about our good deeds. We give credit to him, and we do the strength through, we get our strength through him. One last comment, if you look at an oil lamp from the period, it doesn't put off much light. It's very dim, actually, but it puts off just enough to see your way around in the darkness. But if you had a lot of these lights, then you'd have more candle power, right? The more believers dwell in unity, the more light we can put off together, so that may be an application for us. So this is our memory verse, Matthew 5:16, the logo of salt. Reminding us to be salt and light. Your light must shine before people in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So Jesus doesn't just want, head-only disciples. He wants people who put their feet to the faith. So let's review what I believe he is saying by you are salt and you are light. So salt and lamp would refer to disciples. Saltiness and light would be obedience to Jesus, which manifest in good deeds that point others to Jesus, point others to God. A lack of salinity or a concealed lamp would be maybe people who call themselves disciples, but they don't have any good deeds to prove it. They're just kind of sitting back. So one who calls his or herself a disciple, but does not manifest good deeds, and in the Bible that's also called fruit, is not fulfilling his or her purpose and is as useless as salt without salinity or as a light that you shove under a basket. So there's some very powerful words from the first part of the Sermon on the Mount. So we learned about the attitudes that one should have if we are a disciple of Jesus, and then that concludes with being salt and being light. So I think all of this goes together. If we mourn, if we hunger and thirst for righteousness, then that is a way of manifesting salt and light in our lives. And remember, the ultimate thing is the two greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So we will pick it up next time with Jesus' exposition of the Torah, and he will say, I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And we'll take a look at what that means. And then what are called the extensions. You have heard it said thus and thus, but I tell you, Jesus is coming here speaking with authority. So we'll see you next time as we continue Matthew chapter 5.